Okay, this is our last session of the day, and I'm just delighted to introduce Tom Jenkins. I've known Tom for a couple of decades. I first met him when he was one of the founders of a company called OpenText. They had this crazy idea that a search algorithm could be really helpful for this new emerging network of networks called the Information Superhighway. It wasn't yet called the Internet at the time. The conversation, I vaguely remember, had something to do with that if people searched for terms on this network, you might be able to have advertising that was sort of search specific and could relate to the topic that they're interested in. Well, I'm happy to say this is not a bad news story. Yes, Google and others appeared, but OpenText today is Canada's largest software company, and it employs 7,000 people, and it's doing just fabulously. So please join with me in welcoming my friend Tom Jenkins.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Don and I were backstage walking down memory lane, and I was reminding him that the first time we ever crawled the web for Netscape, and this is around, 94, 95, we were shocked at how big it was. It was a gigabyte, the entire internet. And I remember we were equally worried because within the year, we figured it was going to double to 2 gigabytes. And we weren't sure whether we would have the algorithms to be able to deliver a 30-millisecond answer at the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that from a historical perspective, but I'm also going to try and wrap up the day as best I can and try and fill in some of the gaps. So I'll talk, for example, about open government and my experiences with it. But I'm also going to talk from a perspective which really is I'm a plumber. I'm an engineer, and I've watched a lot of people do amazing things with the internet over the last 20 years. And I'd like to give you a bit of an idea, both current and up to date, and some of the historical things. And hopefully that'll be a good sort of tapestry for everyone to finish the day with. And here's the agenda I'd like to go through to give everyone a bit of a reminder about where we've come, because it gives you an idea of where we're likely going to go. Now, my background on this, as Don had said, is I'm from OpenText, which is Canada's largest software company, but there's me and Jerry Yang in the first cyber cafe in Manhattan launching the Yahoo search engine. And so that's sort of the, I was a little younger back then. But that just gives you an idea of the kind of work that we were doing. And we were the original Google of that era. But being prudent, logical Canadians, we thought that we should go inside the firewall where there was less competition. And so, in fact, we started building social media, what O'Reilly later would call Web 2.0, 10 years before Web 2.0 became a common term. And very specific to the big data topic, and one that I think you'll all find very interesting, we started to build the deep web. And that, of course, was archives that we had to build for regulatory reasons. And then recently, we've been mobilizing all these apps within corporations, the so-called bring your own device. And what I'm going to talk about is our experience of having dealt with about 500 million people. So about 1 in 3 active users of the web are people that we reach out and touch with our technology over the years. And along the way, I like to write books, not as compelling and as nice as Don's, but stories about people that use technology in the different eras. And a trilogy of the books coined the phrase content management or enterprise content management about 10 years ago. And I've also, and I'll touch on these as we go, I've also had the honor and privilege to help Canada articulate some of its innovation strategies. And so I participated and authored a variety of different reports for the federal government. And that'll sort of bring us back into open government and things that national economies can do to harness some of these trends. So that's me, and that's what I bring to this talk. So let's talk first about the evolving IT environment. No surprise to anyone, but it's worthwhile saying this pace is accelerating. For the engineers in the crowd, we have a second derivative, which is positive. It's unbelievable how fast this is going. We were basically doubling, probably every 5 years at the beginning. Certainly, as you see the various terms, cloud is becoming a rather quaint term. Web 2.0, a quaint term. And yet, those are relatively recent terms when we think of that evolutionary stage for virtually anything else in our society. And of course, we can now start to think of the internet as being generational eras. Just as we did in the old mainframe and client-server computing, you can actually tell a website from the original era, a website from a recent era, and a website that we notionally will know will exist soon. So you can think of those sort of 4 generations at the moment. But let's talk about the consequences of the cloud. I thought the panel before gave us all a really good idea about what's happening and where they think things are going. But it's the data. The data is changing. And I'm going to give you some examples of how it's changing. But if you look at the italic on the side there, we're now managing words in a search engine instead of numbers in a database. You know, as Don was saying, this idea of creating, you know, an inverted word index, you know, a nice little grep for the internet as it was back 20 years ago, has evolved into something so fundamental. As we've had speaker after speaker talk today about the power of being able to manipulate something which is unstructured. Remember, relational databases have implicitly in them structure, which allows them to quickly recall through patterns, etc. Unstructured is exactly what it says. It's a mess until we bring some kind of order to it. And of course, that's where big data comes in, and social media, etc. And all of that structure or unstructured comes in also a variety of forms. And that becomes a tremendous challenge. You know, we took a long time to get to relational database standards. We are struggling to get to any kind of standard when it comes to unstructured content. And of course, that then brings the issues around metadata and the importance of metadata. But the single most important thing that we have to manage currently right now, and probably for the rest of our lives, is the pace of growth of the data. As you've seen in you know, comment after comment and speech after speech today, there is no end in sight. No one spoke about us starting to have that second derivative go 0 or negative. No one has spoken about that. We're just on this curve, and it's a punishing curve. It's a curve that technological innovation has allowed us to stay on, but think about any individual organization. You know, as I was kidding before, we were worried about gigabytes for the entire internet. You know, most organizations are worried about terabytes going to petabytes, and then we'll talk about the others, zettabytes and exabytes and what have you later, but you get the sense that this is only going in one direction, so the complexity is increasing. And so embracing that is obviously a good idea. Now, I wrote a book on how people were doing this, and some of the excerpts from the book I'll go through, but people are managing it. And the most important thing to take away from this, though, is that those that manage it better win. I've seen competitive advances, productivity enhancements that matter, that are material, and if you don't do it, you're in big trouble. And it's a message not just for any individual organization, but it's also a message for societies, for civilizations. So early use of big data. I was scratching my head, you know, what's a early use of big data? And I thought I'd just go back to the example that I gave you. Do you know, back in the day, we had limitations to CPU, we had limitations to memory, and we were in a big race with InfoSeek and a variety, Lycos and a variety of the other early search engines, and our fellows came up with a bright idea. We'd start using Bayesian statistics, and we'd start to build predictive caches of what people would ask. And so do you realize when you use search engines, you're actually getting a copy of a search that we predicted you'd probably ask about. So depending on what was happening in the news, we would do a predictive cache based on Bayesian statistics. That's a really good example of a big data application where we are just delivering something much more efficiently and accurately, and it was unbelievable how accurate we were able to, because as the data sets grew, for those of you who know the statistics of it, as the data sets grew, it got more and more accurate. And we'll talk about modern examples of that in a minute. So big data emerges as we get these big data sets. We're a global connected society. We heard lots about this today. Media even, both the traditional and the online. But I always thought this is a good one. If you want to use something to explain to people what big data is, just tell them about Facebook or Amazon and take them to a recommendation engine. Because this is the Facebook page of our CEO, Mark Barrenechea. He's got 7 recommendation engines running. And he doesn't have to think anymore, because with 100 trillion network connections, social media and big data are combining to help him choose his friends and what he's watching every day. But this is profound. Think of what I had said before about databases going to unstructured content. And what do you see here? You see on the left-hand side how we would have Reuters, et cetera, produce automated summaries in the financial services era. Now when you look on the right-hand side, you can see what they're starting to do. Narrative science is making it more compelling for human beings. Don't get me wrong, the left-hand side's still valid, and many people like to see the graphs and the numerics, but a lot of people just want to read about it. But you've got to be able to do that and deliver it in a very efficient way. So the challenge for most of us in this room, well, that's great that Facebook or Reuters or somebody like that's doing that. How can I do that with a limited budget in my organization? It turns out that your biggest investment you probably have already made. So we're going to talk about transforming existing content you already have. And the reality is, where does this existing content come from? Most of you in your organizations, whether it's government or business, et cetera, you did not wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm going to digitize all this. And the reason why is it costs a lot of money to do that. And a lot of money to do the care and feeding once you have digitized. The reality is, most of us do it because we have to do it. And we do it because of the growth of regulation. And what's happened, and I've watched this through my career, since the internet occurred, lawyers discovered the internet. Legislators discovered the internet and liked what they saw. And they basically said, thou shalt keep it all, so I can go back and look at it. And so what has happened across the world, we've had over 100,000 rules and regulations created and growing. And all you have to think of is Sarbanes-Oxley, Patriot Act, etc. And it's getting bigger. As David Johnson had said this morning, 2.5 exabytes every day. When you think that all the spoken words of all humans throughout human history are 5 exabytes, it's a pretty staggering thing. You just have to stop every once in a while and gather that in. And the reason why you need these stats, when you go from here and you're talking to people that are not technical, that don't think about this every day, it's really important to use some of these slides to tell them why this is different. Pay attention to me. This matters. And statistics like this are so important to give them a reference point of what it really means in terms of the human condition. But here's something that I have found over the years that really surprises everybody. Most people think when they go on Facebook or they do a search on Google, they're seeing everything. No, you're not. You're actually seeing the tip of the iceberg. The estimate's pretty consistent. It varies by a couple of percentage points. But the estimates are that the public web is about 4%, and 96% is the deep web. So quite frankly, most of it is behind the firewall, and you can't see it. And that led me to write another book. I don't spend all my time writing books, but I do when there's a big change, and I get tired of explaining it. And so I wrote this book a few months ago, and it's about big data, and it's about what's going on inside the firewall, so that people get an appreciation of what's in the hidden web. And the reality is, most people can't see the hidden web because it's hidden. But being a plumber of all of this, I've had the sort of front row seat to watch what everyone does, from Coca-Cola to Walmart to British Telecom to Deutsche Telekom, etc. And it's been fascinating to watch the innovation. And this book details a lot of that history, and it talks about the creation of big data. It didn't happen yesterday. It started in mainframes. We didn't throw out all the mainframe information and all the client-server information. We just simply brought it along with us on the journey. And a lot of the work that we've done and continue to do is the translation and getting stuff up into a searchable database. And so you can see over the years the different eras. And you can see the great old green screens and what have you down on the bottom. Where do you find all this big data today? Well, there's a whole chart there in the book and lots of examples of where is it inside the marketing department? Where is it in engineering? Where is it in the legal department? It's all there. It's just that we've now sort of kept it all in the departments, but we haven't really aggregated it all so that we can start to pose algorithms against it so that we can get a lot of value out of it in the enterprise. And of course, at the same time that all this content has grown and changed and evolved, and we've translated it, we've also have this amazing new way of consuming it and interacting with it. So we're rich, mobile, social, and personal, and you've heard a lot about that today. So let's talk about the downside of some of this, and then we'll talk about some of the implications. And I'll get to open government and then talk about national strategies that I've seen. So big data issues. First off, at the same time as all this content was growing, it changed. It changed from authored content to collaborative content. I never thought 10 years ago that I would ever see anything eclipse Google or, a similar search site, and yet Facebook did. And it wasn't so much Facebook and Google as it was the rise of social versus talking to a machine. All of us are human beings, and this chart is a reminder that we're human beings. And as speaker after speaker has talked about today, we can talk about how humans should use things and how they actually use things. And you have to live in the world of reality. And the reality is, if we want to know something, we always go and ask someone else. We don't go read the manual in engineering terms or go to the library and what have you. We always ask somebody else. That's the nature of humans. We're social animals. And I think we have to remember that as we build out our systems of the future. This will always win out because it's humans. And yet, access to most of the collaborative content is blocked. So here we have a conundrum. Why is it blocked? What are the issues? Well, security matters. And always remember, WikiLeaks was an issue not of someone breaking in, as we always worried. We always worried on the internet about our firewalls and what have you. That was actually an example of somebody breaking out. And that is a conundrum for organizations, because we naturally assume organizations are homogeneous groups, and they're not. And as we get more and more complicated and the organizations become larger, the affinities become even more dispersed. So when you have information that's unmanaged, big-time things can happen to you that are nasty. So you have to be very, very careful that you know lots of examples, and it's a real cautionary stop. But this then embodies the key IT challenge in front of everybody. If you think back to every speaker, every panel, there was always a yes, but. And the reality is we've got to somehow balance between our liability and our opportunity to create value. And he who creates the right balance is the person that wins. That's the key. It's not that one side or the other side is right. It's the balance that matters. And as I have seen thousands upon thousands of deployments over the years, it's those executives and those IT professionals that strike the balance. Those are the ones who do well. And, what does it get to in terms of words that you may know? Cause, fragmented information, etc., leads to slower velocity, slow to change, etc. And the challenge, of course, is to create this mystical DMZ so that we can work inside the firewall and we can collaborate outside the firewall. This goes to the very heart of the greatest challenge that I see before IT today, is much of the conversation we have, and in fact, much of the conversation I heard today, was in the world of the 4%. And that's a rather simple world, because in that world, everybody has permission. When you publish something to the web, it's because you want it to be found. If you think about the world of, say, Facebook and how they're grappling with this, that starts to give you a glimmer into what's been going on inside enterprise and corporations for 20 years. How do we collaborate internally and then have a controlled, productive, useful way of getting that information outside of the organization, and selectively bring it back in? Those workflows, those business rules, that's at the heart of striking the balance. One thing to understand, though, is that we have a lot of tribal custom in our organizations. And so I have spent 20 years trying to map those tribal customs of the need to know, who can know, when they can't know, when they're allowed to know, all this sort of thing. And it turns out that you can do it. And I've just given you a ladder here of a permission tree. And you can go from no idea. I can't tell you how many times I've had companies call us up and say, your search engine's broken. Well, no, it's not. It's just that you've got the security factor tiled up so high, nobody knows about the existence of anything, no matter what search they do. And of course, you have to make a prudent, judicious sort of business rule to reflect what you really want people to have access to. And of course, you can just indicate title of the document and force the person to go ask their manager or somebody else's manager for permission to see it, and all the way through, allowing the view of a document, the download of a document, the modification of a document, upload of a document. The point is, you can, with great granularity, start to map out the business rules or tribal customs of your organization. WikiLeaks is an example of where that was not done. So if someone's downloading 20,000 documents when in their normal course of job, they are going to handle 10 documents that day, you know, bells and whistles should go off. And that's an example of where this is not a free ticket when it comes to technology and all the things you've heard today. This requires a lot of work. This is, in fact, the most controversial step that I found in deployments of large content systems, because what was verbal and tribal custom actually has to be written down. And when it gets written down, it becomes very political because people are now talking about it because we have to implement it. So for those of you doing this, this step is the critical step, because technology is not just going to save your organization. It's how you implement the technology reflected through your business rules. And a lot of, big data in the enterprise, a lot of things that we're talking about now are something called EIM instead of ECM, because we're starting to build in more than just the unstructured content. We're starting to do business rules. We're starting to do business processes and things like that in this industry now. So let's talk about the implications of big data, the predictive nature of it, and how it permeates everything. You know, we've had a lot of speakers today talk about this, and I'm going to flip through some of this really quickly because you've heard some really good examples. You're here because of it, but it really does permeate everything. When I think back just in the last year, the different organizations I've been in and the different things I've heard about that people are working on, and I can guarantee you, for every one thing you hear in the public, there's 100 being done that no one wants you to know about because that's a competitive advantage for them. So understand, it's tip of the iceberg stuff. The stuff that you hear about that's talked about in the public arenas is just a fraction of what's actually going on. This is one of my favorites about semantics and about the impact of semantics on culture. This is, of course, John F. Kennedy making his declaration, and you can see down through the different social areas the interpretation of it. Unstructured content. You know, in numerics, a number, 3, the number 3 is the number 3. But when you go to Berliner, what does that mean? Is that somebody who lives in a city or a donut, right? Like, semantics of unstructured content make this a very challenging topic. Whoops. Culturomics, forecasting human behavior. This is a public example that I can show. And basically what it is I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. This actually forecasted the Arab Spring. And it's because by the tone of the semantics, remember the previous example about John F. Kennedy and the meaning of words. You can track the meaning or tone of words and infer how a society is feeling at the time. And you can see the red spots and the green spots, etc. And it can predict the demise of leaders. It's an incredible thing. We've seen lots of examples of it today. I'm not going to go through all these, but you get an idea. But the reason why I put some of these up is I want to come back to open government and give you an idea. Early warning systems, Canadian government, Public Health Agency of Canada. They want to prevent, but also to predict on behalf of their citizens if there's a new pandemic coming. And of course, what they can do is, by using culturomics, they can map that throughout the world. Now, enterprise uses IT in a slightly different way. I was giving people public examples. You know, in the enterprise, it's about making money. And it's about doing something as efficiently as possible and faster and better than your competitor. And of course, that's at the core of the ERP industry, which was really the database industry. And they drove for decades greater and greater productivity. And those organizations that embraced it became more and more competitive. Think of the automotive industry or the financial services industry. Now, big data and WebOS, of course, are creating a new transformation. But again, it's not just simply taking big data. We have to juggle 4 other changes going on at the same time at the enterprise. App stores are driving consumer experience. So we can't roll out big data the way we used to. Consumerization of IT, the bring your own device that's been talked about several times. You know, the nice old days of a single, consistent, one vendor, one, computing environment. Those days, they may return again, but right now they're not here. And that's an enormous challenge to make sure that the experience is equivalent across platforms. And what does that lead everyone in this room to have to consider to do? You will not allow apps to come inside your firewall that are off the Apple App Store or Droid or whatever. You must administer, certify yourself. Because if they're getting inside your firewall, you created the firewall for a reason. And that's because it's proprietary information of one form or another. So why, oh why, would you ever let an app in that is going to access that information in some way if you haven't first reviewed it? You heard lots of examples during the day of security issues. This is the next huge issue. We have to be very careful about the smallest, most innocent app gaining access inside our firewall. Example of an app inside business running in iCloud for Business, for example. It's a no-brainer, but it's got to be secure. And that data can never leave the firewall. And the dilemma, of course, is we've got to partition on a sub-device basis. Because users, some of those devices are personal. And users will not allow us to come and wipe clean the content. We have to get a lot more clever about how we manage the metadata and how we manage on a sub-device basis. So that firewall has to be in a very, very clever definition now. That firewall has to be a firewall within a device or within a data set. Those are new concepts and new fidelity that we had not originally thought of. But we'll overcome that, but it's things like this that we've got to think about if we're going to match that IT balance I was talking about before. And there you go, you've got an app store for the enterprise. The other thing about creating value in an organization is flow. Much of today, we talked about 2 things. We talked about the access of content, and we also talked about the social nature. Well, implicit in the social nature is the idea of flow. But in an enterprise that wants to make money, the flow has to be structured to the common good or the mission of the organization. And the best one that is borrowed from the ERP industry is order to cash. I'm taking the order for a good or service, and I want to get paid because that's how my organization replenishes itself and goes forward. And the efficient flow of that, write once, use many times, and the de-risking of it is everything that any organization does. I can't tell you how many times I have met a retailer or an energy company or a government, and they say, I'm actually in the information flow business. Because that's where the competitive edge comes from, not the subject matter expertise. And lastly, I'd like to talk about national digital strategy. So, here's a quick run-through of a lot of the things we heard about today and the things that I've seen. But I've also been involved in what does it mean for societies. So we've talked about organizations at an atomic level. Let's talk about societies now. And the one that I know well is the Canadian situation. And the Canadians are always comparing themselves to the Americans. So we're the small country beside the big country. One of the things that has concerned us is that, relatively speaking, over the last 30 years, we've had poor productivity. And so our competitiveness against our next nearest market has declined. Now, you'd sit there and say, am I in an economist session here right now? What does all this have to do with IT? It turns out it has everything to do with IT, because more than 75% of this gap is due to the lack of adoption at the same pace of ICT. And I have to tell you, this is probably the single biggest policy hurdle to overcome for government people, is that when we talk about tech in societies, it's not about Apple or Google or Cisco or whatever. It's actually about the mom and pop grocery store or the miner or the oil giant being more competitive and more productive. This perhaps is the single biggest thing. I'm going to talk about some other things in a minute, but just that, understanding that leap, I've watched policymakers grapple with that within society and indeed with their colleagues in government. There are many converging forces on a government of a society, and some of them are shown here. But I would say to you that the greatest opportunity we have, based on everything that we've talked about so far, turn government into an app. If government started to do that, then they'd really harness all of those trends. Now, this is not for the faint-hearted, because as we've heard today, there are many, many challenges. As we just heard on the most recent panel, there's a big difference between somebody posting, the accounts receivable of a company or putting a database up of users and somebody publishing my health records. You have to remember that this is a non-trivial thing to say. But let's talk about turning government into an app and what has been going on in open government, and then we'll talk about what some of the things that Canadians have been doing. So government apps, just like in an enterprise at a societal level, they can do a lot of good. Open data initiatives, what happened with the Obama administration is very, very instructive. They came in with a lot of vigor, and that administration said, open it up. Many, many other governments are very reluctant to open up the data for a whole bunch of reasons, and yet, by doing that, it allowed society to create with it. Here's 3 examples of a database with something that got created from it. And just think, for those of you that use those services on the left-hand side, where you would be today if you didn't have them or an equivalent. GPS government data, an enormous treasure trove. Education curriculum, what NASA's done. U.S. farming, revolutionized it. They can't control the weather yet, but it at least allows them to manage with it. Canadian government, I've got the pleasure to be on the Open Government Advisory Board. Minister Clement will be here on Wednesday. Corinne Charest, the CIO of the Government of Canada, they both have done a lot of work on this. And these are some examples here of what's been done. Oceanographic data. Think of the Canadians participating in the Arctic and the Arctic starting to melt. And the use of that data for the first time for people that are traveling in those waters, exploring, et cetera. It's an enormous, enormous enabler. Germany. Open data initiatives, apps for Deutschland. They called it their eGov initiative. So there's lots of examples that are out there for people to use. And it's amazing, once you put the data sets up, what people start to do with it. But there are issues. These are some recent headlines that I just thought I'd pull up. Patriot Act is a dilemma. It's very understandable why that legislation occurred, when it occurred, but it causes other societies to pause and think about, well, how do I go about doing cloud? So let me conclude with the Canadian side. National Digital Strategy for Canada, the Digital Economic Strategy, as seen through the eyes of 2 centers of excellence that was created by the federal government. And the reason why I put this graphic up is after many, many years in the Canadian situation, they started to realize that the innovation chain, yes, part of it is entrepreneurs and universities, but another part of it is incubators and collaboration and venture capital. And so the GRAND is actually the University National Centers of Excellence, and the Canadian Digital Media Network is actually the Entrepreneurs and Private Sector National Center of Excellence. And the two work together, as you would expect, but what I found very interesting about the Canadian initiative is that they recognize the difference. that you can't just have one do all of it. You have to start to think about the innovation chain. And what that led to was national participation, as you can see here. And if you're not from Canada, the logos there are virtually all participants in society, the so-called tool makers and the tool users, regularly getting together in a big user conference called the Canada 3.0. And last year it had 6,000 participants, which is a lot of people for Canada. And appropriately, it was held, because it was so big, it was held in a hockey rink. And in fact, there were thousands that participated online because they ran out of room. That gives you an idea. And for those of you from government, the single most important thing to understand that your role is convening power. You don't have to throw a lot of money at this problem, but you do have to show leadership. And the Canadian government here showed leadership. And they built it, and guess what? A lot of people came. And they did amazing things. The group in the Canadian Digital Media Network grouped together and actually revolutionized the way we run the world. They revolutionized and created a secure collaborative site for the world leaders. So they were able, with their Sherpas, to actually become much more efficient the way they run a G20. That's the power that can happen when you bring a group of people together and a government sponsors it and allows that creativity to come forward. And internationally, the Canadians have now linked up with the Brazilians, and they have a Brazil-Canada 3.0. And the Brazilians were just in Canada a few months ago, and the Canadians are going down to Brazil. So you can set it up internally, and then on a bilateral basis, start to exchange ideas with each other. So in summary, I think the most important thing that we need to do is don't put our head in the sand. And don't think that because we got social media figured out, we've got the whole internet figured out. Well, guess what? Even after big data and all the other things we've talked about all today, the one thing that is for sure, 5 years from now, there will be a whole bunch of other things. And one of the slides that I found very, very compelling for leaders to imagine is the story of China. So many people think China is rising. China is returning. You have to understand, China is returning. China missed the Industrial Revolution. China was about, depending on how you measure China in the Asian basin, was about 1/3 to 40% of world GDP in the Roman Empire era. So you have to realize China was always there, but they missed the Industrial Revolution. And the challenge for our enterprises and the challenge for our governments and societies is even missing a piece of this will result in our society or our people being diminished relative to the other societies that are able to grasp this. And I always found this slide to be very powerful to explain to people it really does matter. Thank you very much.